Hello, everyone, and welcome. Please, it'll take a moment for everyone to arrive. We've got a nice large group. And as you're joining us, please take a moment to say hello, share your name and where you're from, so the panelists and I can get a sense of who's in the room, and we can engage in some really dynamic conversation today. Again, just going to give just a moment as everyone starts to enter. It's so fun to see everyone from all over the country. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started as everyone's kind of coming on in. Just good afternoon, everyone. We're really glad to have you with us. My name is Ann Henschel. I'm the Director of Early Learning here at the Hunt Institute. For those of you that may be new, attending a webinar for the first time, I just want to share a little bit about the Hunt Institute, which is actually the creation of our founder and namesake, four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt. And the Hunt Institute serves as an education policy support to governors, state legislators, and other high-level state elected leaders. And we cover actually the full spectrum of education policy from early childhood, prenatal, I would say, all the way through the workforce. Obviously, in our early efforts series, we focus on early childhood, the early childhood portion of the continuum. And we're excited today to welcome just an amazing panel for a great conversation about creating inclusive classrooms that meet the needs of all children. So today we have as our panelist, Dr. Sarah Vanover. And Sarah is the Policy and Research Director at Kentucky Youth Advocates. She's also the author of a brand new book titled Including All Children. And we'll probably learn a little bit more about that in the moments to come. And then we also have Dr. Bridget Mitchell, who is Director of Professional Development with the National Association for the Education of Young Children. Again, thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Jennifer Washburn, who is the Executive Director of iKids Childhood Enrichment Center in Benton, Kentucky. So pleased to sort of have a group of very talented experts joining us. And so with that, I think we'll go ahead and get the conversation started. I do want to do a few housekeeping items later in the hour. For those of you that have participated in our early efforts webinar, you know that we really pride ourselves on hearing your voices and trying to sort of engage in some real conversation with all of you. So there will be some time for your questions with the panel. If you'd like to contribute a question, we really ask that you pop that question in the Q&A box. As you can see, the chat box gets filled very quickly. So if you have a particular question you're really hoping to share with the panelists, if you could put that in the Q&A in the Zoom toolbar, that'd be great. Also, today's session is closed caption, so you can access those settings at the bottom of your screen. And then finally, as always, you will be able to find the recording of today's webinar on our YouTube channel within the next few days. All you have to do is go to YouTube and search for the Hunt Institute. All right. With that in mind, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So Sarah, I'd like to start with you. As I mentioned in the introduction, you've literally written the book on this topic. So if you could just get us started by kind of grounding us in the context. When we talk about programs being inclusive, what is it that sort of, how do you define that? What is it that you think of when you think of an inclusive classroom? And also, can you just share a little bit about what you see as benefits and possible barriers to creating more inclusive classrooms?
Well, again, thank you so much for letting me be here today. Inclusive can be a very vague term, and we use it so often today. But when I wrote my book, Including All Children, I really identified inclusive classrooms as being classrooms that have children with many different ability levels, specifically focusing on including children with disabilities, children with chronic illnesses, and children who have experienced trauma, so that they could be in a setting where their differences didn't stick out so much. They weren't isolated from the rest of the children their age, and they could be in a setting where everybody came together and shared their strengths and their weaknesses together. And it's a struggle in childcare. Many children with disabilities bring on additional financial costs for childcare programs, and we see a lot of times where they might not be included in a lot of settings. There's so many benefits to having inclusive classrooms. Children learn from each other. You know, in the medical world, we often hear see it, do it, teach it. And it's also a familiar concept in Montessori classrooms where we observe first, then we try and do something ourselves, and then we master our learning by being able to teach it to someone else. And a multi-ability classroom setting really has that principle at the heart of it. Children who maybe need more support can learn from their peers. Children who are developmentally at a typical level or even more advanced can solidify their own learning by teaching peers and showing them how to improve. And we learn to appreciate everybody as bringing different strengths to the table. Some of the barriers, though, we see kiddos who might have extra needs. And again, that causes additional financial costs for childcare programs. And we know that childcare programs are financially unstable in their own right. And so bringing those kiddos into the classroom and supporting them may put additional financial burdens on the program. One of the things I talk a lot about in my book, though, is sometimes we kind of set ourselves up as a past director and somebody who has administered a childcare program. Sometimes we set ourselves up to exclude children with different ability levels just by the policies that we create. When we create no biting policies, when we create expulsion and suspension policies, and certain behavior policies, discipline policies, by putting kids in timeout and having escalating discipline policies, we often inadvertently target children with disabilities who don't understand those policies or are exhibiting typical behavior. Even biting policies affect children with typical abilities and definitely our kiddos who have non-typical abilities. And so we really need to take a hard look at the foundation of our child care programs and the policies that we put in place so that they can be more inclusive. As a parent of a child on the spectrum, we've seen, our family has seen policies that really target my son more than they would other children in the classroom. And just by making small changes, that the policies can really support everybody instead of excluding certain children.
Thank you. And yes, I too have a child on the spectrum, and it does give you a different lens and perspective, and why this conversation is so important. So thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Bridget. Um, from the National Association for the Education of Young Children's sort of perspective, I know that NAYC is not only the nation's largest sort of professional organization, but it's also a terrific resource for early childhood professional development. And it is the widely acclaimed accrediting body for high quality early childhood education programs across the nation. So can you just share a little bit about this notion of inclusivity and how that fits into the work of NAEYC, both in terms of maybe professional development and program standards?
Sure, and thank you for the question. And Sarah, my conversation will really connect really well with what you shared. So for NAEYC, developmentally appropriate practice is the cornerstone of the work that we do. So NAEYC believes that all children should have access to high quality early learning environments facilitated by well-prepared, intentional early education professionals who understand child development and how children grow and learn in the context of a dynamic systems of support. So in relation to our commitment to inclusivity, we are continuously improving and enhancing our seminal work that includes our developmentally appropriate practice, also known as DAP, our own early learning program accreditation, and program standards to foster inclusivity and reflect the contemporary needs of children and of our workforce. So for NACCE, DAP is embedded in our program standards as within every other element of the work that we do. And the program standards are our foundation for our early learning program accreditation that measures and supports high quality early education programs. So these standards are currently under revision, and rightly so, because we have also recently revised our DAP, and we are really striving for alignment with DAP, our focus on equity, and the importance of understanding the context of the family in relation to supporting optimal child outcomes. Sarah, I am a trained Montessorian, in this conversation, I just can't help but think the importance of children and families, and how each is critical to the work we do. And so part of our success and the impact we've had with our NACCE Early Learning Program accreditation is that we are very thrilled to share that over 500,000 children are enrolled in and have access to accredited programs. And that's a huge celebration, because this translates into children having access to early education programs that honor and value who they are, celebrate their gifts and talents, and where learning is facilitated in a play-based early learning environment. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. And I do appreciate that. And really, it's almost a core value of NAOAC as our professional organization, is this notion of always engaging in that we as a profession and as a field are continually learning new information. There's new science and research, the brain's, brain science. So always as our professional organization, being able to sort of make adaptations and changes to those standards of quality and thinking in terms of development appropriate practice. But I think, Jennifer, she sort of set you up pretty nicely here, didn't she? So let me sort of pose my question to you. And that is, as the director of iKids Childhood Enrichment Center, you're literally living this every day. So talk about, often it's your voice, those that are still working directly with children. I miss those days, hold them dear to my heart. But talk about how you've made inclusivity a priority at your program, and maybe also about like the supports that your staff and providers like yourself need from states and partners in this space to make the sort of complexities that Sarah was referencing and the sort of enrichment of it successful.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having the voice of providers on here as well. I mean, you said it so nicely, as we are living that daily, and we really truly are. iKids Childhood Enrichment Center is 25 years old. I opened it 25 years ago, and we've been NACCE accredited for over 15 years. So we have grown with NACCE as they have reviewed their developmentally appropriate practice multiple times, which I think is a wonderful thing as we see children evolve, our practices evolve, and as we learn what is truly best practice for our children and our families. So again, thank you for having and including us as part of this voice today as well. And yes, speaking to what Dr. Vanover and Dr. Mitchell both said, inclusivity includes not only the children, but the entire family. And it includes when these children, these friends are in a group care setting, it includes the caregivers as well. So as we are looking and focusing and finding ways to better help and better assist the children and the families in our space, we also want to look at how we better support our teachers within that space as well. And so I know one of the questions that we've talked about before is, how do we help different states to recognize and realize that a lot of these supports need to come from a systems level? And so one of those things is ratios. Here in our space, we do adhere to the NACI ratios, which are smaller ratios. We're in Kentucky, and NACI ratios are smaller ratios than the state recommends, or minimum recommendation from the state. And NACI's, obviously kicked it up a notch. However, we all know that there are days that even a 5-to-1 2-year-old ratio is a bit too many 2-year-olds, especially when that is about the age when we start to see different developmental milestones maybe not being met. Or that's when we start to see those flags coming, where we start to examine, what do we need to change in the environment to better support this child? Gosh, and if we make that change in the environment to support this child, what might it do to this other child? It might totally wreak havoc on them. And so we're balancing meeting the needs of every single child that comes into our space. So when we talk about being inclusive, we're talking about everybody. And we're talking about making sure that our environments support the children, the families, and the teachers within our spaces. So there are many things that we need. Number one, developmentally appropriate ratios. That's a start. Number two, ongoing support for individualized professional development. And what I mean by that is not just you get one class a year, maybe for a couple of hours, but what I mean by that is individualized. So the opportunities for early childhood mental health professionals, or folks that are truly trained to really look at the child's behaviors and come into the spaces and say, this will help you with this child during this time in this space. That's more than just a once a year professional development seminar. We need things that really are going to speak to, how do I meet the needs of this child within my space? But then there's a next level to that. We also need parental development. How do we help teach the families so that we're all working in community to help support the needs of the child? So that's a big answer, right? And that's kind of a big ask when we're talking about how do we support our children and our families. It's a systems approach. We have to support as a system, not just an individualized person in that little silo. And place to start, and I speak to this wholeheartedly, those lower ratios, the supports that we get through our accreditation, which means we're constantly reviewing and able to see what are best practices, but also including in that systems approach, the families and the teachers, so that we can all be united for the goal of supporting the child.
You've really captured, I mean, she's just sort of done the components of what quality early childhood really requires for all children. But you did it in such a nice way. Thank you so much. I guess I'd like to tease out each of those pieces around the ratios, the sort of quality environment. But I think for the moment, Sarah, I'm going to turn it back to you about this idea of the professional development. Like, how much of professional development an issue, particularly when we're thinking about really sort of embracing this idea of inclusivity in childcare settings, often, especially now, with so many new teachers having very little training typically, and a kind of similar to what Jennifer was just alluding to, sort of taking maybe just some very, very basic core classes, and yet having to deal with some real challenging behaviors and different types of needs. So what do you see as key to helping to support teachers?
teacher training is a huge portion of this. I did my undergraduate degree in early childhood education at the University of Kentucky when it was really just starting off as a program, maybe, over 2 decades ago. And our degree program in Kentucky is a dual degree. It's in early childhood education, but also in special ed. I got a couple of classes that talked about this is what this disability is. This is what this disability is. But then walking into a public school preschool classroom, a year or two later and having more than 50% of the kids in my class have an individual education plan for special needs, I was completely overwhelmed. I did not feel prepared for the setting that I was in. Then we have childcare programs who have entry-level staff because most childcare programs only have the ability to offer entry-level wages. So we get new staff, we train them as they become part of ours to get them a CDA, to get them an associate's degree. But it can be very overwhelming at first not to know how to work with children who have challenging behaviors. And honestly, a lot of staff members, when they get to choose their training, they sign up for things that they think are fun. They go to art trainings, they go to music trainings, and those are great, but they might not address some of the key issues that they really need training on. And this is where it's key for a director to step in and help those teachers develop a professional development plan and say, these are the areas that we need support on, or even do whole facility trainings on issues that they know their entire staff need. But there are so many trainings about different types of disabilities or working with challenging behaviors that need to be incorporated at kind of entry-level status to the field. Of course, all of us have those pre-service trainings that are required by the Child Care and Development Block Grant in our state, where we learn about minimum health and safety, identifying child abuse and how to report and things of that nature. But we need to get to the point where working with children with different ability levels is also entry level, and that all staff members need to have it. Now, going and sitting down and learning from a speaker over a Zoom or reading a book, those are great methods of training, but some of this needs to be in the classroom as more of a technical assistance model than just hearing about it and saying, oh, I should do this. Having mentor teachers on staff, really trying to develop some experienced mentor teachers that can then help develop younger teachers and do some modeling, directors that have had this experience and knowledge that grew up as teachers before they became directors, making sure that whether it's a director, assistant director, or an educational specialist on staff, helping having them in the classroom to model behaviors, because a lot of it is watching experienced teachers how they interact with those students. If you have a child who is always going to tell you no, and you ask, would you like to clean up the blocks? No. Well, okay, you've set yourself up there. And so our young teachers really need to watch those behaviors of mentor teachers and see how they interact and what they do in challenging situations, how they use natural consequences instead of putting children in timeout all the time. And then, getting some of those skills developed so that teachers don't feel overwhelmed. When I've read research on why teachers leave the field, of course, pay is part of that, but most teachers don't leave because of pay, because they knew going in that they weren't going to be rich working with young children. Most leave because they feel overwhelmed doing their job, or they didn't feel properly trained. And so those are things that we need to address from day one, getting people the training that they need so they feel successful, developing training plans with the director, sitting down and talking to the teacher about the skills that they need and picking trainings that align with that, and then making sure that we have mentors on staff that will help assist young teachers as they grow up in the field.
Oh, beautifully stated. And I had the privilege of starting my career in a lab school, and so I think about those were sort of natural mentors for me. And so many of the campuses across the country have lost those lab schools, and so this idea of the mentor teacher is even more critical today. And I know there are some states that have some phenomenal. California, I know, has a really strong mentor program, a statewide program that they have available. I don't know if any other states have work that they're doing around mentorship, but
A lot of
please
the
share that.
apprenticeship programs now, many states are expanding their apprenticeship programs. I know in Kentucky, we've done a lot with not only student apprenticeship programs and childcare programs, but adult apprenticeship programs and even director apprenticeships. But those apprenticeships assign a mentor teacher as they go through that. And they often get a CDA and like maybe some basic college credit during the length of the apprenticeship. And the apprentice is not typically left alone, so they have somebody to watch. So those are other ways that we can begin to guide teachers, because working with children with disabilities it is not something you can read in a textbook. Every child with a disability is different. Raising my son, every child with autism is different. So you can't say that I've read this book about autism and I know how to work with these children, because they're each so different. But watching how a mentor teacher reacts in the classroom and the type of reactions that they offer, that's huge.
Yeah. So, Bridget, I'm going to sort of let you just sort of take the conversation. So as you're listening, what's sort of coming up? I have a sort of set canned question, and if you want to talk about that, you're welcome. It does sort of talk a little bit about sort of a possible framework, but as you're sort of listening to the conversation, what's sort of surfacing for you from that NAOIC perspective, or even just from your lived experiences as a professional?
Well, thank you for the question. And first, my first inclination is that I'm delighted to hear the perspectives of my colleagues, and this notion of theory to practice has been something we grapple with in early education for a very long time. And so as a faculty member also, I think about how do I prepare students to really meet the real challenges of the classroom and to support families in real time. And listening to each of my colleagues, I just jotted down notes, and I thought, what we do in education is we identify those indicators, those big ideas about what is quality for our students. But I think some of the work still needs to be done, and really helping our students to operationalize and differentiate based on those students. And I'm just thinking about a child-centered an environment where teachers have permission, Dr. Vanover, to make those in real time changes of the learning environment that would benefit all children in the learning environment without hesitation. So, to the question, I know we're going to talk about the unifying framework a bit, but the unifying framework really adopted those professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators as the core competency for everyone. Really thinking about those, what skills and what knowledge is necessary, Dr. Washburn, to really bring what we hope to do live in our classrooms. And I think part of that is the way that we train teachers. And so hot topic in all of my classrooms is around special supports for students. And many of my students say, do I need to know all of the medical jargon? Do I need to know everything about every child? And my response for them is that you need to know the child. That's very different. You need to see the child, you need to value the child, you need to know the child, and be committed to follow the child through that learning experience in that classroom that's well supported for the diversity of need of your students in your classrooms. And then Dr. Washburn, to your point, I often think of this work in relation to the ecological model. So we have the child, we have the family, we have the school, but very seldom we talk about how this impacts community. So this work is very necessary because the children in our care now will be the adults in the future. And as we pour in and provide those necessary inputs into their lives, and I want to say as a caveat, demonstrate and model that we are all have these differences that we bring together to create a shared experience, which impacts our entire society. So I have really enjoyed hearing the perspective of my colleagues from a theoretical perspective before in practice. Dr. Washburn certainly talking about ratios, teacher qualifications, classroom setup, curricular choices and decisions. All of these elements are exemplary of quality.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Washburn. So as you've listened to all of this, you want to kind of weigh in what specific resources have your teachers found particularly helpful here, and any other sort of highlights as we're sort of engaged in this discussion.
Absolutely. So wonderfully dynamic conversation. When we go back and think about myself as a director for 25 years, I have to look at where do we start? The teacher, the young person, the eager person who walks into our door to put in that initial application, they're coming looking for a job, right? And so we want them to go, okay, well, I love kids. I love how I feel when I'm with kids. And so then I have to say, well, how do I support them in learning after that first moment? Because we know that often we teach, we parent, we guide the way that we were taught, parented, or guided. And so I can't automatically assume, as the center owner director, that the person that I'm bringing into my space knows what my expectations are, knows what framework that I'm using, knows my values, and knows how I want to support children. And so I then have to make sure in Kentucky, right? And Dr. Vanover spoke to that. All of our new folks in the field have to do what's called orientation, basic orientation. It's 6 hours, and they're supposed to learn everything they need to know. Well, we know that that's just the starting point that gets us the basic in safety, and we need to grow from that. But in growing from that, I want to be able to make sure that I keep my folks, right? So how do I keep these folks that often in our early childhood settings are coming in and maybe they have an interest, but don't yet have a formal education? Not yet. And so how do we set them up to start being willing and eager to pursue their own growth? Their own growth and development. How do we make that, number one, accessible? In Kentucky, we have money that's been invested in the forms of scholarships to help our folks that are working for us to start to invest in themselves, right? And so, because a lot of us in this profession are really good at giving to others, and so starting to learn ourselves to make ourselves stronger can be a little daunting at times. So supporting those teachers while they're in our space to take that next step. And guys, these are going to be baby steps, right? So for us, it's getting that 6 hours done, encouraging them, working with them, maybe getting them into, in Kentucky, we have an amazing apprenticeship program. So having them sign on for an apprenticeship program. And in that baby step, they get through the month, and then we get them interested. Oh, you've accomplished this, and oh my goodness, you are on your way to a CDA. And so then we give them the next little bit. Growing up, we always heard, "How do you eat an elephant?" Well, I don't want to eat an elephant, but how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. And so yes, we have this moonshot, but we want to really get our folks on that pathway. And so to really, not only as a state set out what this pathway would look like, not only as NACCE does, that unifying framework that's there, but myself as the owner director, what does my framework look like to support my folks in growing in that way? And then making those things happen, making sure that, yes, Sarah, Dr. Vanover, I would love to go to all the make and takes. So how can then we as trainers, right? So those of us that are training at the make and take, how can we then make sure that during that art make and take, we're talking about how to modify or differentiate that specific lesson to meet the needs of all the children in the space. Maybe the child that likes to not touch anything sensory, or maybe the child that likes to wear sensory. And so how do we modify within those trainings to teach, right? They want to come to the make and take. How do we teach that training so that we are within that space giving them supports that they need? Another thing that we want to really think about is how are we being respected as an industry, as professionals? And someone mentioned it in the chat, making sure that when we work in Kentucky, we have what's called first steps. So as we make those referrals for children that we might think, oh, let's look for a full assessment. How do we come to the table to share our experience with the child to help make sure that our voice, our experiences, what we see, what we learn from the child's behaviors while they're with us are shared as part of that initial meeting with first steps. But now we've grown past first steps in Kentucky, and they're now 3, and they're moving into the Head Start, preschool Head Start program. How do we get a voice at the table for the IEP meeting? How do we help when the child has an IEP? How do we help support those goals, that individual education plan? Excuse me, when they're with us in our space. So us being seen as professionals, as the professionals that we are, and as the helpful information givers, we're not going to necessarily diagnose, but we can give that information from what we see and experience when they're with us. Most importantly, too, making sure that we, maybe those of us that have specific training in the field, are not afraid to continue getting education and training, but also aren't afraid to share that information, again, with the children, with the teachers, and with the families. We all need to work together, all need to have a voice and a place at the table for that same goal, supporting that child.
My friend Calvania Radford already put it in the chat, but I always encourage teachers that you are not diagnosticians, you are professional noticers.
Yep.
And we notice. Yeah, I use that term so much in trainings and in books because there are teachers who have worked in the field for a long time, and they know the second the child walks in the door, what's going on and how that is probably impacting the child. But we are not diagnosticians, we're not medical doctors. And when we see things, we let parents know that we've noticed this and we've noticed that. And we say, maybe it's time to talk to the pediatrician. Maybe you can do a referral to your IDEA Part C, like Jennifer said, we call it First Steps in Kentucky, or to the public school system. But we don't ever want to place a label on a child. Sometimes the child may have an IEP at the public school, and the parents don't want to tell us because they don't want a label on the child. And that really is a break in communication when we can't support each other, but the parent is trying to protect the child. The other thing that I really try and stress with the teachers, and Jennifer, alluded to this, when we have a child who's coming in who has a disability, a lot of times that can lead to discipline issues and the child being in trouble, especially when it comes to suspensions and expulsions. I mean, if you've read Walter Gilliam's research on preschool suspension and expulsion, children in preschool get expelled 4 times more than in the K through 12 system, because we're small businesses, because child care programs don't always have the resources to support. But a lot of times when a teacher is dealing with a classroom full of 20 preschoolers, 2 teachers with 20 preschoolers, let's stress that part. But I mean, a group of 20 preschoolers is overwhelming no matter how many adults are in the room. And you have that child that's exhibiting those challenging behaviors due to a disability. It becomes like this battle of the wills sometimes between the teacher and the child. And you're like, I will get them to do what I want. Or I've seen teachers that are like, you will sit at circle time. You're going to sit here the whole time that we're doing this. And instead, we really have to take a step back and say, what is the root cause here? What is causing this? What is, my child, who I mentioned is on the spectrum, has a lot of aggression, and often will hit or will strike out. And for the longest time, I was just so frustrated. I thought he had oppositional defiancy disorder or something going on. And with some support from more experienced people than me, because I I wasn't able to look at my own child objectively. Imagine that. But we really figured out it was anxiety. He was so afraid of new situations and so afraid of things that were going on that he was lashing out and going into like fight or flight mode. When you realize that a child is scared, you don't have that desire to discipline them so much anymore. You see them in a whole different perspective. And, you know, if we can get to the root reason that some of these behaviors are happening instead of wanting to discipline, then I think it changes our perspective. But when you're new, when you don't have that much training, when you're in an overwhelming classroom all day long and you haven't gotten your lunch break when you thought you would, then sometimes it comes down to, I'm going to get them to listen to me because I have to have control over this situation. And so, you know, encouraging staff to say, yes, this is overwhelming. Why do you think that child is doing that? No 2-year-old comes to school and says, I want to be terrible today. You know, they don't come to school and think, I'm going to drive everybody crazy. But, you know, we don't know what's going on in their heads. And if we can sit down and watch and notice and figure out what's happening, then that can really prepare us so much more than just being adversarial all the time.
And I would love to jump in and a little bit listening to Dr. Washburn and Dr. Vanover. You know, my primary role at NACCE is to develop professional development. So I've done some deep thinking about how we do the work. And my team has landed that when we provide a professional development, it should do 3 things. So one, it should reshape perspective. It should help teachers, early educators, think about how they see the work. And the second is practice. We talked a little bit about that, but like really moving that theory and operationalizing it into the doing, in the classroom. And then lastly is the process. Help them think through what are the right strategies, tools, and techniques that I can employ in this classroom to support the dynamic needs of students. And I think as we are crafters of professional development and dreamers of impact in the field, that we really need to be intentional. To Dr. Washburn's point, that there are many trainings out there, some are formal, some are informal, that our educators participate in. But I think if we could champion the effort and really think about some of these critical elements, what should they know after you know, being in a conversation with Dr. Vanover or Dr. Washburn? What should they be able to do when they leave those conversations? And then how can it positively impact outcomes or developmental outcomes for young children and bridge support for family and community? And I think those are some of the ideas top of mind when we're creating training, because often we choose the subject area, and then we share everything we know about the subject area. But what about that intentional effort to say, I want to share what I know, I want to know what you know, and I want to be a partner in you doing the best for children and their families. So those are my top of mind ideas, thinking about professional development in this context. And I know we're in a really robust conversation, but I would also like to share that NACCE's virtual public policy forum is also coming up. So if you are interested in joining this conversation with the passion and enthusiasm that we all hold, please visit our website to enroll. We are privileged to have keynote speakers, Katie Ham, Swati Adakara, Glenna Wright-Gallo from the administration, discussing the updates in policy, as well as the conversation around inclusivity in early education.
Thanks,
I
Dr.
do want to add real fast. You guys said some great things. We want to make sure that we continually include our parents, our caregivers, and our families in this conversation. You know, you had talked about being partners, right? Sharing what I know, sharing what you know, and then coming together to move forward to put into practice to better support the child and the family. And so I think that holds true too beyond the teachers and the providers working in that silo, but always including the child's first and best teacher, which is that family. And again, we have to say first and best. And I know there's a lot of debate going, but maybe they don't know how and what to do. Maybe they don't. Maybe we don't either. And so together we need to talk about what's working, what works in my space, what works in your home space, and how can we again talk about the strengths from a strength-based approach. How can we then look to grow, nurture, and support this child? Because once we all share our wins, and we have to also share the tough parts too. But if we can identify similar wins, we're going to get more wins. So, but we have to be specific in that. We have to not be afraid. And so as those professional noticers, we want to make sure that we also notice the strengths in our families, the strength in our parents, and support them along the way too.
And sometimes you need special training on how to deal with a special needs parents.
Yes.
We can be high maintenance. Sometimes we have a tendency to over advocate for our children. And so there may be training on how to calm us down when we freak out, because we may have a pretty strong freak out reaction when we know that our child has a diagnosed disability.
Hard. I want to take a moment to just sort of move us so that there are some questions that are coming in, and I want to make sure that we have a few minutes to answer those questions. I also I'm really hearing something that's being articulated so clearly in this webinar is just the deep level of complexity that it takes to be a highly professional, sophisticated, effective, quality teacher of young children, and particularly at this time in our country where we have lots and lots of children with challenging behaviors. The other thing, I just want to step back as sort of from the Hunt Institute perspective of, for those legislators or legislative staff or policymakers that are out there, I want to be sort of cognizant of helping them to understand the complexities of why this work is so important, why being treated as professionals is important. But more than that, I think one of the questions that came in, I just want to share, and maybe Sarah, you could take this one around kind of what how do we address, or what are your thoughts around establishing inclusive preschool in public schools? I think this is different from state to state. So I'm guessing this is probably a state where there's sort of preschool classrooms that are sort of the special ed children, and then there's the sort of other classrooms. So do you want to just sort of speak to that for a moment?
This varies so much because our public schools are set up by state statutes and state regulations, and they're state funded. And so every state is a little bit different. In Kentucky, you qualify for public school preschool if you have a diagnosed disability. And, that's one of the main ways that you qualify. In other school systems, in other states, I've heard where there might be a typically developing state funded preschool and then one for children with special needs. First of all, I will say that federal funding comes through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to the public school system to support children from birth through 5. It comes in the birth to 3 programs that are usually home visiting, like Dr. Washburn talked about. And then it comes to public school for our 3 and 4-year-olds. So partnerships with our public school system is one of the only ways we can get special education support for young children with disabilities. And that's critical if families can't afford therapy, if families don't know where to go for a diagnosis. Many states are under-resourced on just finding a child psychologist that can evaluate a child to see if they have a developmental delay. And so that public school system is key in that. Now, IDEA also has other laws. It has laws that say that every child needs the least restrictive environment. So to be as included as possible and to still be able to function, to have access to that if they do have a disability. So if a public school system isn't offering special needs preschool, that's huge because there are federal laws that mandate that. Now, within that, if you have the two separate classrooms within the public school system, if you have preschool for young children who are typically developing in a separate room, we need to look at what that least restrictive environment is. We need to say how much of the classroom, because if it's play-based, everybody should be able to play together and the teacher should just be able to adapt lesson plans. If you're doing a math lesson on, you know, how many blocks can you build before they fall down, then you should be able to adapt that up for children, maybe, you know, more advanced children to make an incline and see if the car goes down the blocks when the incline is deeper versus children who are just exploring blocks and touching the texture and might not be ready to build yet because they don't have the fine motor skills. But in a play-based environment, all those children should be in the least restrictive environment. They should have the ability to play together regardless of their disability level. And then therapists can come into the room and support kiddos who have an IEP and might need physical therapy or might need speech or might need occupational therapy based on their individual education plan. We want to make sure that kids with disabilities have access to those IDEA supports because they might not have insurance that allows them to get it. They might not have some place to be diagnosed. And so I feel like the state-funded preschool with IDEA as a support is a huge part of special education support throughout the U.S.
Thank you so much. Dr. Washburn, I have a question that just came in. I think that will be a good one for you. What are your thoughts on helping to get parents and IEP teams to include the early educator, the provider, and share that information with you?
I know that in our space, that is something that we work on at our intake for our families. You know, we you know make sure that we ask families because we do share children. You know, the Kentucky the way that we do in our community, our preschool Head Start program, the children that qualify, they go to that program in these schools, the public schools, from about 8 to 11. And then they come to us for the remainder of the day, and then they're with us all day on Friday. So we know the children that are being served in those programs, and it's up to us then to advocate to be at the table when there's the IEP meeting. Parent may not know who to ask. You know, they may not know to ask, can I bring a friend? And I may simply say, can I be your friend? And go with you and go with that family to be able to share our experience because we may have the child from noon to 6, which is actually longer than the child is in the preschool Head Start program. And then we have them all day on Friday, all the breaks, all the summers. And so we have to be that best advocate to ask and request, may we see, may we be a part? And then, you know, that's one thing to get that paper. It's the next thing to go and have an opportunity to talk with that teacher at that program and say, what does this look like in practice, right? To read the IEP and see the child would do X 80% of the time. How are we getting X? And so what does that look like in your space? And how can we mirror that? How can we support that in our space? Because if we then support that in our space, how amazing is that for that child? Because then they're getting a continuity of care. It just explodes wonderfully. But we have to start with, in our policy, asking to be a part. We have to advocate to be a partner, saying how we can be helpful, and then asking the question, what does this look like in practice? And how can we help that to be practiced in our space as well?
Thank you. Oh my goodness, that's so powerful. And that's talk about just again going the extra mile of being the friend and sort of talk about partnership with the family and really honoring them.
When we do ask, we also have to be prepared that the family may say no and not want to share that personal information because there are federal laws that protect that diagnosis and give the family privacy. And they might not do it forever. You know, if somebody enters Jennifer's program and she asks them, they might not be ready to for 6 months, but then they develop trust and then they'll say, okay, we're willing to share that. But we have to remember that the family does have some privacy rights and might need to develop that trusting relationship before they want to share that with you.
Thank you for that reminder. So, Dr. Mitchell, there's another question that came in that I think around, there's actually been a few of mentions in the chat around just feeling really isolated, overwhelmed with the number of children that either already have an IEP or don't have one, but are clearly exhibiting signs of some sort of needs. And sort of how does one find a mentor that can help, and especially for those that are family child care providers, so they're a lot more isolated when they're at home, and they don't necessarily have that kind of a network of support. So any thoughts that you have on that piece? And then actually that, and then just because I know you all have so much to say, and I'm watching the time is quickly slipping away, if you could share any thoughts on that, and then anything that you wish you would like policymakers to know regarding this topic, and hopefully we'll have enough time for each of you to sort of answer that as we sort of wrap up. But go ahead, Dr. Mitchell.
So I think to the first question, listening to Dr. Washburn, and Dr. Vanover, so we know that the systems of support that children have, I have worked with a large school district, and understanding that those professionals for students are just one player in the conversation. The classroom teachers are one player, but it takes the entire school and school community to really wrap around this idea of differentiated support for all students. And I'm going to say for that real-time support, we are mentors to one another. This is some of the big, challenging, difficult work for all of us, and regardless of where we stand in the work, but to create that kind of peer support system. I think for family child care, some of the community resources, but I think there's also this opportunity for school districts to expand their supports, to think about, like, okay, so who are those other providers that are impacting the children that will be in the system of learning for the long term, because we are one community. So I think that's one way to think about it. And then your last question was?
Just anything that you would like for a policymaker to be considering or being mindful of around this topic of professional development and inclusion of all children.
So I think in relation to professional development, inclusion of all children, we all own this work. It is really important, and our ability to get momentum in this work is going to require each of our voices and talents, and the investment in this work has a dividend long term, because it impacts our society, those folks that are making the decisions. So I often think the baby I hold in my arms will be running the world. They will be making the decision. They'll be the next CEO. They'll be the next. And so just knowing that, I think that highlights, punctuates why this work is important, and why the investment, and then why these conversations are so incredibly important. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. Dr. Washburn, you want to take it, then I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Absolutely. I think we need to remember, like I said from the beginning, ratios are important. So we really do need to make sure that we are acknowledging that we need investment, and that's monetary too, so that centers can seek that accreditation standard, that developmentally appropriate standard, to have lower ratios. That's not only best for our children that have identified needs, that's best for all children. So 100% looking at what is a developmentally appropriate ratio, and then ongoing continual investment in teacher training, teacher development, but also that wage that teachers are being paid to be in this field. Recognizing and acknowledging that these foundational approaches, that these foundational experiences, these foundational environments that our children are part of, are critical for the long term, for the forevers. And it is absolutely important to invest in appropriate wage and salary, appropriate and beneficial education, and then also appropriate ratio so that those teachers can use what they learn, put them into practice, and change the world. That's all we want to do.
So final word, Dr. Vanover.
Well, I'm going to agree with Jennifer on this. If you want well-educated, well-trained professional teachers, then you need professional salaries. And that's one of the biggest things that our policymakers can think about is how we support the early childhood workforce, the same way that we support the K through 12 workforce. And that's a huge component. The other thing that we have to think about is, are there incentives for private childcare programs to support children with special needs? We know that it can be financially draining. Are there policies in your area, policies and funding support that can support centers who are willing to make these sacrifices to make sure that children with exceptional needs have the care that they need, and that we can support those families? So often these families are the ones that also have extra burden, extra financial burden. They're paying for more doctor's visits. They're paying for therapy multiple times per week. They're paying for diagnosticians, and paying for childcare can be extremely expensive when you're looking for very specific care that will benefit a child who has additional needs. So if we're going to support these families, how can we incentivize the centers to do that and make sure that they have all the supports that they need, so that a child with a disability isn't just taking up space in an early childhood education classroom, but they're actually getting to engage and be a part and learn and grow. And so those are things that policymakers have to consider. These are parents who are in the workforce that need the support to be a part of the workforce, and they're children that have medical and developmental needs that have to be addressed at a young age so that they don't continue to get more and more complex.
Well, all of you that are still out there listening to this amazing panel, thank you for participating. We really have, the chat box has been blowing up. It's been really a dynamic for those of us that have been engaging in the conversation. Appreciate all of you, and a special thanks and gratitude to each of our incredible panelists. Thank you all so much, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you, everyone.